Welcome to Blogging Heads. My name is William Beutler, and if you are seeing me on your screen or hearing me on your podcast, that means we are going to talk about the intersection between technology and policy. Joining me today to discuss a topic that I don't know a great deal about, but find very interesting, is Edward Niedermeyer. So, Edward, tell folks about yourself and tell them what our topic is.
Well, I'm Edward Niedermeyer, as you said. I started blogging about cars at The Truth About Cars back in 2008, and I've been writing about cars and the car industry ever since. I currently am a contributor to Bloomberg View, and I'm working on a book on the topic of, today's topic.
Right, which is the future of cars, and a lot of it's going to be about the autonomous vehicle, or driverless cars, as it's called. And the approximate reason for us holding this particular dialogue is the announcement from a couple of weeks back that Google is releasing the next generation of their driverless car. And this is not the first one, of course, because they have released at least one or two models in the past. But this one made waves because it was all new. It had no pedals. Like, it wasn't adapted from another car. It had no pedals, no steering wheel, and it looks funny. So tell us, Edward, what exactly is Google going for with this vehicle?
Well, yeah, as you pointed out, this is their first sort of in-house design, and in the past they've modified other cars, mostly Toyotas. With this, they're building they're actually having it built for them by a supplier, but they're getting 100 to 200 a fleet for testing purposes, just like the previous models. But as you mentioned, the key really to this design is that it has no steering wheel, it has no pedals, it has none of the traditional controls. I think that's really significant because we've had basically the same control scheme in all cars essentially since the 1916 Cadillac. So it's about 100 years now. And so by doing away with all of that, Google is really firing a shot across the bow of the car industry.
It's interesting. I mean, so the car industry, I'm curious to know how the car industry views the Silicon Valley. When they look westward from Detroit, what do they see out there?
It's, fear and envy. There's definitely...
Fear and loathing?
Yeah, there's absolutely some loathing. I think there's definitely a tendency on the part of the traditional automakers, people who work in the traditional automakers, to look at Silicon Valley and to say, well, they just don't really understand the car business. And that's because what Silicon Valley, whether it's Google, even Tesla, all of these new attempts at the car industry that are coming out of Silicon Valley, the whole point of them is to be, sort of fresh sheet of paper and to not be tied to this century of tradition of sort of this is the way we do things in the car business.
Right.
So on the one hand, there's this sort of dismissiveness. On the other hand, I think there is a growing realization on the part of the car business that they don't have all the answers when it comes to reaching, especially younger consumers. I think they're increasingly worried that Silicon Valley has more of the answers to some of these puzzles than they do.
So how is the car industry doing right now? Obviously, there was we had the bailouts recently, and I'm somebody who doesn't drive. Actually, I live in Washington D.C., where there are taxis and Ubers and buses and metro trains all the time. So I haven't driven in about 10 years. I don't really experience cars a whole lot myself, except as a passenger. What is the industry like? At least is it making money right now?
Yeah, well, I here in Portland, Oregon, is also a city where owning a car and driving a car is not exactly the height of fashion. So there is definitely, because of things like Uber and there is a tendency, because you're seeing these Silicon Valley firms getting into the car or the mobility space. I think they would say there's a tendency to think, I think, that the car industry is completely dead, especially also because of the recent bailouts. And that's incorrect. So, I mean, the car industry is definitely ready to be disrupted, but that doesn't mean it's not making money right now. What's really crucial, I think, to understand is that the car industry right now is making a lot of money selling the last couple of vehicles that the baby boom generation individuals are going to buy. And those are being sold at quite high profits in the developed markets. And then in developing markets, the auto industry has really good growth prospects. They have much lower per capita car ownership rates than we have in developed markets. In developed markets, once this baby boom sort of bubble kind of is over, there's some real questions about whether subsequent generations are going to continue to buy cars at the same rate, whether the love affair with the car that baby boomers had is over or not. And I think that there's economic reasons and also cultural reasons to suggest that the baby boomer sort of, again, love affair with the car may not continue with subsequent generations.
It certainly occurs to me that this is going to sound a little odd, I suppose, but the car has been replaced by the smartphone. The car used to be the instrument of freedom, but nowadays the smartphone is free in a totally different sense. You may be in one place, but in the virtual sense, you can travel all over the place. I have some teenage sisters who have been really nonchalant about getting their driver's license, but they are all over social media, for example.
Yeah, and I mean this is something that's happening on two levels. On the one hand, we're not physically disconnected from each other the way we once were because of all of this information technology. For example, It sounds like I could be in Adams Morgan with you as we speak.
Listening to the sirens. They're coming for me. This is the problem with cars.
So on the one hand,
we must destroy the car. Yes.
On the one hand, information technology is absolutely taking away the need, especially for younger people, to connect with their peer groups, which is sort of the primary activity of young people. And then on the other hand, there's sort of a compounding effect now too that we're seeing, which is that smartphones are actually allowing consumers to get mobility, access to mobility on the go with apps like Uber, Lyft, relay rides, things like that. So the smartphone not only has sort of replaced the car in a certain level, but it's also continuing to erode our need for cars in all kinds of different ways. And I think that's going to continue to happen. So
we should talk about Uber a little bit, and I do want to get back to the Google car, but since we got over to Uber, you wrote a piece where you argued that Uber is just a speed bump, and this was regarding they've certainly had some very large investments. First, they got $600 million from Google Ventures. Then last week they got $1.2 billion from other investors. What was the argument you were looking to make in that piece? And we can link that in the sidebar.
Yeah, well, so, I mean, I was arguing a couple weeks ago that $10 billion seemed like a high valuation. I'm not an equities analyst or anything like that, so specific valuation issues.
What's the valuation? Is it over 10, but they got 1.2 billion?
They got 1.2. They're now, that 1.2 was at an $18 billion valuation. So,
18. All right. Okay.
Yeah, my skepticism about the $10 billion valuation was not exactly followed up by Wall Street. But look, I think the key was actually, I wrote that piece like days before the Google car came out. And what we've seen is Uber has justified not only its $10 billion valuation, but now it's gone up to $18 billion in the wake of that Google car announcement. I think that all of the enthusiasm about Uber is fantastic. And like I said, it's really, it's providing access to mobility in ways that is fundamentally affecting and will continue to affect demand for cars. And it will totally change consumer expectations about cars and about, access to mobility rather than having to own your own car all the time. But my question is, what happens when the autonomous cars come around? I mean, Uber is a business that is built on relationships with their quote unquote partner drivers. And, so when I wrote that piece, my question was, look, Uber is a bridge to the autonomous car, but once the autonomous car comes around, I mean, Uber's business model stops making sense. Now, what's the new sort of $18 billion idea, I guess, is that Uber will sort of operate the fleet of Google cars or something like that. I think that that's going to create a huge political problem for them because they're going to have to fire all of their partners that they're building their business on now. And I also think that as autonomous cars become a reality, you're going to start seeing automakers totally rethink all kinds of aspects of their business models, which will actually put them into competition with Uber. At which point, Uber's high tech, their technological advantage versus an automaker's technological advantage. It's an interesting comparison, which is going to be the easier to cross over, if that makes sense. Would it be?
Yeah, I suppose so. I was going to say that it was certainly my thinking when I was reading that piece that, why wouldn't Uber just become the company that brought you those driverless cars? They're already in transportation. There must be other, moats they can dig around their transportation business. And gosh, if they don't have to pay drivers, that might work for them. But am I missing something there? You think so? Apparently.
Look, it's possible. And again, I wasn't really until Google made its announcement, I didn't realize how aggressive they were even going to be. I mean, this took everybody in the car world by surprise, and everyone's sort of reassessing everything right now. But again, to me, the problem is simply, right now, Uber is about connecting human consumers with human drivers. Obviously, from a technological standpoint, it's easier to replace the driver with a robot, relatively. What happens to Uber's brand in that process of replacing these partners that they're literally their business partners, without which their business doesn't work? Replacing them with robots, I see real problems with that transition there.
That could be painful.
Yeah, and frankly, I think it's going to be easier for companies that are making cars to operate them. Essentially, what's happening what's going to happen with autonomous cars, as these other issues are reducing demand, especially with as new generations of consumers come online. What you're going to see more of is actually automakers themselves accepting this reality and getting away from forcing people to buy a new car and instead moving to something that is more like an access versus ownership sort of situation. So the example of this is Car2Go, which is where Daimler, Mercedes, basically they took these smart cars which were not selling well in the United States, and essentially they just leave them scattered around a city like Portland. And here, I can't speak for everywhere, but here it's become very, very popular. You just look on your smartphone. There's a car that you would never in a million years consider buying yourself. But when it's sitting there and you just swipe your phone on it and drive off, and then when you're done driving it, you leave it at the side of the road. People will approach that. So
people are leaving smart cars like litter on the curbs of Portland, is what you're saying.
Yeah. And they're loving it because, like I say, I mean, a smart car is a very tough sell to any American who wants, because chances are if we're buying a car, we want it to, drive to the next city or across the country or up in the mountains or whatever, right?
So, not in DC, I'll tell you that. In DC, I actually see a surprising number of smart cars that are clearly owned by somebody, and I am assuming this because there's no logo on the side. And we never see our SUVs. That's DC, where no one goes to the mountains here. Yeah.
Well, anyway, like I said, I think that what's happening is that more automakers are going to get into this model where they can build more niche cars that they don't have to sell to everybody, but that they can make attractive to anybody on a access basis. So that instead of having their business model being built on $30,000 up front on the sale of a car, which is the average transaction price, that car instead is a revenue stream rather than a one-time cash transaction, and so that people are paying for that. So what I think is that as automakers get forced more towards that revenue stream model instead of the upfront sale model, that's going to put real pressure on Uber, who is just the facilitator. And I think it'd be much easier for an automaker to license Uber's technology in order to move into this business model than for Uber to somehow inject itself and become like the king of autonomous cars.
So what you're describing essentially sounds like a phrase that I haven't heard, but borrows from some familiar phrases. You're describing cars as a service or automobiles as a service. Is that a phrase people use? It is
Yeah, I mean, I think mobility as a service is the concept of mobility
Okay.
is you're hearing that more and more in car circles. And so,
Got it.
yeah, as a service. And I think one of the really good ways to think about it is it's the Kindle car, right? Where, you know, you used to buy books. It's not a perfect analogy, but I think it's a pretty decent one. I think that
Okay.
instead of buying books that have to be sold at a profit and therefore force the printer and the publishing business into these huge scale, you know, the need for huge scale and all this other stuff, instead you sell a Kindle at a loss, and have that be a platform for revenue. And the beauty of autonomous cars is that not only are you looking at car as service fees. So you're you know, paying per mile or whatever it would be, like a taxi. But on top of it, then that autonomous car also, because you don't have to be looking at the road, is also a platform for all kinds of advertising and a whole bunch of other things that can create really interesting economic models that are going to create really dramatic alternatives from the model we have right now, which is you have to go out and spend $30,000 of your money or borrowed money to buy a car that you own. So,
Boy, I was about to say that, boy, I can't really imagine Google putting advertising in cars and people being okay with that. And then what's the first thing I remember is the last time I was in New York, every single one of those taxis had, and even increasingly here in Washington as well, you know, these taxis have a little screen in the back seat, which at least you can turn off. But I wonder if Google would, you know, disable that. I suppose there's no way that you would want to have ads in the car that you own. But if you don't own that car, maybe that's a trade-off people are willing to make. That's a big shift, though.
Yeah. But, you know, I mean, again, look at it from Google's perspective. I mean, at a certain point, Google, I mean, I don't know about you, but my email, my web browser, I mean, Google has me every which way, right? At a certain point,
Right.
the only time that I can escape Google's clutches is when I'm in my car driving, because I can't be on my smartphone or my tablet or my,
They're gonna fix
my
that.
computer. So literally
Yeah.
at a certain point, I mean, the smart car it's two things. Well, it's a lot of things for Google. The two main things are, one is it's the ultimate validation of Street View, because it basically will be proof of concept that Street View is so good that you can put a physical object into it and navigate it. But the other thing is that it also it literally takes away that your one refuge from Google, which is in the car. And
Right.
you know, if they can filter your reality 24 hours a day, and they're going to have the incentive to do that.
That's such a vision. I'm curious, you know, Google, the last time they made hardware, I recall, it didn't necessarily work out so well. You know, they bought Motorola Mobility, and then they ended up selling it not too much longer. I mean, do you really see a point in time where Google is manufacturing a serious number of cars itself?
That's a good question. And that's actually, I think, the question that the car industry probably is most curious about, because it gets back to this question of what is the relationship between Silicon Valley and, for lack of a better term, Detroit, you know, the automakers.
Right.
Sure.
Sure.
And I think that, you know, the traditional car maker approach is, you know, we're going to co-opt Silicon Valley. I think they realize that's not going to work. I think now there's some fear that at a certain point, you know, there's always talk about consolidation in the car business and bankruptcies and everything else. It's a really tough business to be in. I think that there's a big question about whether or not Google will wait until another bankruptcy and buy assets so that they can have sort of a manufacturing wing. B, I think the most likely thing is that they will basically, that there are suppliers who are actually doing an increasing amount of the nuts and bolts work of automotive design. So they're not a brand that you would have heard of. Companies like Johnson Controls or Magna or Roush is actually the company that is contract building this test fleet of prototypes. So
who are they? What do they do? What are those companies? What do they do otherwise? Are they basically like the Foxcons of Detroit?
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. So Foxconn is like a contract manufacturer. Really, what it is that more and more cars are built out of subassemblies, and the supply chain creates increasingly sophisticated subassemblies. So, like an entire dashboard console, for example, could be provided by a supplier, which in turn works with 10 plus, sub-suppliers. And so the supply chain in the car industry is huge and incredibly complex. Consumers only know the brands, right? And even then, there's way more brands than anyone can keep track of. I think the most likely scenario here is that Google buys something like, a supplier company, rather than messing with the cultural issues that come along with trying to partner with an established traditional automaker. Because a supplier will always be your partner, right? You set the tone with them, and they realize your vision. And with any of the car makers, it doesn't matter if you're talking about the Detroit, the Japanese, the German, all of them, they all have history and culture that anybody who comes in with a fresh, blue sky take on the car business, like Google is doing, is going to run into cultural issues there. So
makes sense.
Yeah.
Well, so we've been talking a lot of technology and not so much policy yet. Building on the fact that you said they're going to run into some cultural issues, I assume they will run into regulatory issues as well.
Yeah.
And the way I want to get into this is I want to ask about what I know is happening right now. Like I say, I do not spend a lot of time around cars, but I do, I'm aware that, for example, more of these manufacturers, the existing ones, are building, technologies into your vehicle. They can park themselves. They can do certain things themselves. And so we're kind of entering this middle ground. And I can totally understand a world where, everybody drives and there's no automation. That's the world that you and I grew up in, until the last few years. And then it sounds like at some point in the future, and maybe not this decade or next, but eventually we will get to a point where it's DC is going to look like Minority Report, and my Google car is going to deliver me right to my front door, here on the 4th floor of my apartment building. So I don't understand the middle ground. Like, if the idea is that sometimes you're in control of the car, sometimes you are having the car take care of it. Doesn't the human error of that seem to be too much of a problem? And will regulators actually let this continue in this way? That's sort of long way to get to my question, but what do you make of that?
Yeah, these are really tough issues. Yeah. One of the big things that always comes up is the question of insurance, and I think that you put your finger on the key issue. What the specific solutions, both technologically in terms of the insurance issues. It's hard to say what those solutions are going to be exactly, but I think that the key is that the transition period has to be short, because you put your finger on the problem, which is that computers, if it's all computer drivers on the road, if it's all autonomous vehicles on the road, you're fine. If there's all humans on the road, then you're fine also. It's the in between, right? It's how do you deal with both? Now, I mean, we do get a little bit into prediction land with this stuff because as living in DC, regulation is not exactly something that there's always this balance between what's best and what can be sold to the public as being the best policy. But on the other hand, what are the entrenched interests, and what are the entrenched interests trying to protect?
Who's going to prevail, right?
Yeah, and I think in the case of autonomous cars, you're already seeing the more conservative car companies are really emphasizing the need to keep a driver behind a steering wheel. So this whole Google vision of getting rid of the pedals, getting rid of the steering wheel. So actually, it's an interesting regulatory issue with that right now. Google can do this with this test fleet because they're limited to 25 miles per hour, which makes them, they fit in this category called low-speed vehicles, which means they're not allowed on freeways, they're not allowed on any road where the speed limit's higher than 35 miles an hour. And because they fit into that category, there are no standards in that category for controls. So you can literally have motorcycle-style controls, or like in the case of Google, you can have no controls. When you get to a fully regulated on-highway vehicle, which is what all major automakers sell, the regulation, the regulatory bar gets much, much, much higher. And then under the current regulatory scheme, you absolutely have to have a steering wheel, pedals. I mean, there are specific guidelines, regulations of how they're allowed to be placed and things like that. So right now, under the current regulation, and so what you're seeing is that you're seeing that the conservative car makers working from that assumption that they want to try to keep someone behind a steering wheel basically as long as possible. And so what you're seeing is like GM is an example of a pretty conservative, one of the more conservative car makers, and they're already branding their sort of autonomous drive thing. You know, every automaker knows they have to play in this area, but GM is branding it as a super cruise. In other words, to them, this is just sort of the next step of cruise control, and this is something that'll just be on the freeway, basically. And I think everyone agrees that at first, that's the first step, that, you know, regular vehicular controls, and just when you get on a freeway, essentially, it's really, we only need to go a half step beyond the sort of radar cruise control systems that we already have on luxury cars.
Okay, so that's the clear break. If you're on surface streets, then you're in charge. Once you get on the freeway, it is going to be, all right. I mean, that seems like a plausible place to draw that. Plus, you know, freeway driving, you know, can be tedious. I say this as somebody who hasn't driven on a freeway in a decade. And
I think No, it's just really quick. Long term, I think that cities and freeways are going to be where the autonomous car takes over. And I think that so in like other developed countries, like markets like Europe and Japan, where there aren't a lot of rural highways and whatever, like there are in the U.S., aren't as big of rural populations. You're going to see a high percentage of the cars becoming autonomous vehicles. Here in the U.S., where we have relatively high rural populations, a lot of rural highways and whatnot, my feeling is that we're going to have to keep those rural highways open to manned traffic for quite a long time, just to prevent having to, major kind of social upheaval.
Right. Stick a pin in the insurance things. I do want to get to that here at some point. First, I want to go back a little bit. So interesting. I'd be interested to know who is on the more, say, progressive and who's on the more conservative side, besides just GM. Is there a way that they line up? And where's Japan on this? Is Japan out ahead of us? So, how does that landscape look?
Well, it is. There's a bit of a spectrum. So, if you say Google is on one end, right, and they're the extreme vision of full embracing the autonomous car, they have no interest in manned vehicles. Have they're only interested in autonomous cars, and they want to radically re-envision what cars can be. So you put that on one end. On the other end, I would say, GM, but also Fiat Chrysler now, they don't even have the money to get into this technology at all, really. And so you have this is going to be one of those issues where you're going to see the more marginal automakers really struggle to even keep up. So someone like Fiat Chrysler, they're not even really playing in this at all. GM, I'd say, represents the other vision, which is the other extreme of the vision, which is that they accept that it has to happen at some point. They have to keep pace with technology. Every company does to some extent. But what they're going to try and do is manage the change and manage perceptions of it. And rather than presenting autonomous cars as this great unlocking of all kinds of potential, which it really is revolutionary technology, they're going to try and portray it for as long as possible as like an option that you basically get to upgrade your vehicle. And so then
Nissan.
So in between that, I would say would be like Nissan. And I think they're a really good example of a company that is trying to balance both approaches, right? Nissan doesn't get a lot of credit for it, but they've invested far more in electric vehicles than really any other automaker. And they've also really committed much more to autonomous technology than any other automaker outside of, I would say, Google. So they're like they're the most I would say Nissan is the most forward thinking on this technology of the established automakers. Tesla is an interesting case too, though, because they sort of come more from the Silicon Valley school, obviously, but they're also a little bit throwback in the sense that performance is a lot of what their brand image is built on. It is all about being a sexy and powerful car. So and fun to drive. So whether they embrace the autonomous technology revolution, that's just as interesting as the Toyotas or the Hondas or the Volkswagens of the world. Volkswagen, I should mention also, actually they got into this research really before anyone else has, but they've also been slower to commit to it than Nissan has. So you're seeing lots of different approaches to this across the car industry.
Gotcha. Let's do insurance really quickly, and then after that, I'll talk about the ethics and wrap it up. So the insurance, I remember reading, The Economist did this big takeout on driverless cars. It was at least a year ago now, and it was fascinating, although I haven't visited it recently. And the concept that it introduced to me for the first time, and I've heard here and there since, is in this future of driverless cars, we may come to this point where insurance is too expensive to allow people to drive cars. How realistic is that? And if that's not quite realistic, what is the more likely shift going to be? Or is that for real? What do you think?
I do think that's where we're heading. Yeah. I think, look, the reality is everyone thinks they're a good driver. And very few of us, really are. Yeah, no, I mean, it's because you don't have you're not really, you don't have a car. You're not you don't have to buy into the mythology of your own awesomeness at driving, because you don't take your life in your hand every day, you know? People who go out on the road, they are literally taking, putting their hands in their lives in their hands. And so they have to think of themselves as good drivers. And anyone who is out there on a regular basis on the roads knows that most people aren't good drivers. Most people are terrible drivers. And even people who are good drivers, have moments of human weakness that are largely unavoidable. And if you look at a lot of other sort of social ills that get a lot of attention, especially in the media and whatnot, you do the math on the statistics, you find that cars kill a lot more people than you would think. And on road deaths,
number. It's 30,000 people a year. That's a lot of people. It's
pretty shocking, and especially you add up all the economic costs and all that. So to answer your question, I don't think it's going to be hard. I think that takeaway is correct. I don't think it's going to be very hard to insure robot drivers as long as there aren't going to be too many other humans on the road. And then I think that what happens is that then will put the onus on the human driver, where it's going to then become extremely expensive to drive your own car. And I think that kind of like riding a horse, that was replaced by the car as the dominant mode of transportation. But for the very, very wealthy, it remains a sort of cultural symbol or something. I think to some extent that's kind of where driving your own car is headed. Again, I do think in this country, in the U.S., we'll continue to have outlets for self-driven vehicles and areas for self-driven vehicles longer than a lot of other developed markets. But globally, we're absolutely moving. And the urbanization trends are clear that we have to move to something, because otherwise the traffic is just, it can only get so much worse,
Right. All right. So for our final segment or aspect, whatever we'll call this, the ethics of driverless cars is sort of another issue that I hadn't thought about too much until recently. And so I'll preface it with this, and then I'm curious to know where else you would take this. In psychology, there is a thing called the trolley problem, and I've definitely heard this on other blogging heads recently. It's kind of one of these interesting topics. I'll do my best to summarize this. Let's say there is a runaway train coming down the tracks. It's got 5 people coming at it, and if you do nothing, then these people are going to die. But let's say there is a overweight gentleman who you can push to, let's say, knock something out of the way, and then these people will live, but he will surely die. Most people, when they do these studies, say that they would let those 5 people die because they can't bring themselves to actually take the forward action of causing someone to die. And so this has been asked a whole number of different ways, and there are different scenarios under which this is asked to get different answers. And this question, which has always been a question for humans, there's a similar trolley problem. I guess it's the autonomous vehicle problem. And this is, what if you are going head on with a bus full of school children, and your car is aware that the only thing the car can do is either go forward, kill all those children, or swerve, drive you into a tree, and then kill you. It sounds silly and it sounds scary, so I don't know how seriously to take it. but it's definitely something I've heard come up more than one time. So tell us, how much should I worry about that in 25 years? And, what other issues of driverless car ethics are there?
Well, I mean, yeah, I think that 25 years from now, we'll look back at this specific question and we'll say it was one of the most interesting, provocative sort of philosophical questions. But I don't think we'll look at it as being one of the fundamental challenges of implementing and of transitioning to electric cars. I think the ethical problems. Well, so how I approach this specific issue, and it is something that gets written a lot and looked at a lot, and it is a very provocative and very interesting a philosophical question, and I think it's something that will have a lot of impacts on a lot of other issues. Anyway, how I approach it is that it's sort of like a micro decision, sort of like microeconomic ethical question, for lack of a better context.
Microethics.
Yeah, microethics.
Yeah.
But then in the big picture, right, in the macro ethical picture, there's going to be so many fewer car crashes because we've replaced very, very error-prone human drivers with robot drivers. That I think that these micro-ethical questions are, while legitimate and, again, provocative and interesting, they're going to pale in comparison to, again, the broad progress that we're going to make in terms of on-road deaths as we transition to autonomous vehicles. Frankly, I think the real ethical issues with autonomous vehicles are going to have to do with, sort of what we were talking about with Uber, with this transition of what happens to drivers.
Jobs.
I mean, jobs. Yeah, exactly.
Right.
And so it's two issues. On the one hand, you have, taxi drivers, limo drivers, all these other things. But also, right, if people are going to be switching almost entirely, if the social norm switches towards access to mobility, prefers access to mobility over buying a vehicle, all of the auto manufacturing jobs, and like I said, the whole way the car industry is set up now, which is built around volume sales, getting as much sales volume as possible in order to spread these huge fixed costs across all these models. As that transitions, the job disruption is just going to be huge. And so, to me, the ethical question that are raised by autonomous cars are not so much the internal, how did the computer driver navigate different moral mazes. That's interesting, but to me, the bigger moral dilemmas are like on the macro level, on the society level, and the macroeconomic level, and I think the jobs is really going to be one of the big ones.
That is huge. Absolutely, that's going to. I can see even in this future where there might be a program, in the car, or there might be some lines of code that could kill you. That's still going to be a very rare circumstance. I do believe driverless cars would be safer, but the jobs thing seems like that could affect millions of people. And has anybody even started to talk about what we can do except, have fewer babies, kids? I don't know. Has there been any talk about and I suppose this is a problem that we never entirely solved around. I mean, boy, Roger and me was, 24, 25 years ago now, maybe, almost 30 years.
Yeah.
We have that issue, we had to grow out of it, or many people never did. And so many towns died, but drivers are everywhere. And so that could be, and I have thought, since the 2008, crisis, that coupled with the rise in automation, I'm surprised that the unemployment level has got down to where it is now, because it seemed obvious to me that this was a new structural norm, but these cars could produce an even more stark structural change in unemployment. Yeah,
that's right. And to be honest, I think the answer to your question is people aren't really, there's so many other questions of implementation, insurance, the technology, all these things we've been talking about. There's so much to unpack in all this that the sort of jobs impact and the sort of macroeconomic impact. There's no doubt, right? You look at Uber and people are getting wealthy off of this revolution in mobility. But the question is when the transition takes place, or once it's taken place, I don't see. It just seems like it's another case of huge amount of jobs disappearing and not being replaced with anything obvious. So to me, that's one of the great unexamined ethical issues that's gonna have to sort of come out, and that people who cover this story, I think, are gonna have to really keep in mind as they go forward, and because that's an aspect of this that I think has been left out.
That's good. You actually make me think of one last thing I'm curious about, and that is, you mentioned when the transition happens. And so I've certainly seen Nissan, or someone said that in 2020 they expect it to start to change. I'd be curious to hear your, level-headed assessment of when you think that is, and also when do you think we're going to start to see like the regulatory fights heat up about this? If there are two sides, I assume those fights will begin well in advance of driverless cars starting to take the road in big fleets. How soon should we expect any of this?
Well, I mean, look at the headlines coming out of Europe just today about the Uber protests there. You can see that, obviously Europe is generally speaking a stricter regulatory environment than the U.S. And so you're seeing these tensions mount faster there than here. But even there, you have these protests that are on the one hand, bringing these cities to their knees, to gridlock. And on the other hand, Uber is also saying that they're benefiting out of them too, out of the publicity and everything else. So I think that the battle over the sharing economy writ large, and this is in mobility, but also in things like Airbnb and all of these different things. I think the regulatory battle on that is beginning. The lines aren't really drawn yet. People are still figuring it out. On the transport side, it's with the mobility side, it's gonna be, so I definitely think, Nissan says 2020. I think that between 2020 and 2035, 2040, an Ernst & Young report said that basically that 2020 to 2035 window is really where we're going to see this transition, the bulk of this transition happen. I mean, I think for people in the car industry, they look at that and they say that's like a product cycle away, and there's no way it's going to happen so fast. But Google is obviously, and that's what's interesting is that, Google may not ever build these cars themselves, but what they're doing is that they're knocking over these sort of Jenga blocks that hold up this construct of traditional car ownership in this country, which again is this 100-year-old sort of institution. And I think as each one of those blocks get knocked out, whether it's by Uber or Google or Tesla or what have you, as more and more people re-examine what their real needs are in terms of mobility, car ownership, all that, I think you could see this transition accelerate pretty darn fast.
All right. Well, I'm looking forward to it with some trepidation, but excitement. I've always been telling people that I'll move to Los Angeles as soon as driverless cars are the norm. So maybe I'll be planning my retirement in that case.
I think that's what it would take me to get me to move to Los Angeles too. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the weather's good, but the traffic just scares the bejesus out of me.
Yeah.
So, Edward, thank you very much. This is a fascinating topic. We'll have to do it again sometime. Maybe when that fight begins.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Thanks.
Thanks, Bill.